Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to our second speaker series. We're looking to have really authentic and real stories from entrepreneurs' point of view, their past, their current, the surprises, the challenges, the wins, everything we can cover. Our speaker today is Andrew Button from Mashup Labs in Nova Scotia. And I have all kinds of things I'd like to talk about. I've had the privilege of knowing Andrew for a while, and he supports also tons of other entrepreneurs. So I'm excited to not only hear his perspective, but his point of view through the lens of all the other new entrepreneurs he meets every day. So to start, I'm going to just do a little bit of logistics. I'm going to be watching the Q&A. So on the far right, Q&A is where I'm watching. If you'd like me to bring up a question to Andrew, feel free to engage in the chat with the rest of the audience and talk. I'm not going to be looking at the chat. I'm going to be looking at the Q&A. And we will finish with time. We're going to go into a networking area where you're going to be able to mix and mingle and have conversations with Andrew and other members who shared the experience. So at the end, we'll convert to that. So to get started with the talk, Andrew, instead of me going through any kind of bio, which nobody likes anybody reading.
Oh, thank goodness.
We're going to talk about some of your history and your whys and what has happened in the past. But maybe right now, tell me a little bit about what your company or what your businesses do today. How would you describe, elevator pitch style or whatever you want to say? What do you do now? What's your world?
Yeah, so the most important thing to know about me and what we do is I am unapologetically a rural guy, right? So I grew up in a small town in Newfoundland, met a girl from a small town in Nova Scotia, and spent the vast majority of my career working with people in small town places to help them take ideas and turn them into businesses. And that's really where the idea for Mashup Lab was born, with this obsessive focus on unleashing rural potential. So we do that in 3 ways currently today. So we run what we call activation events. So those are events that we host sometimes in person, mostly online, where you just kind of get the creative juices flowing and get people sort of that collision of ideas. The second way we do that is through several rural co-working spaces. So we own one here in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, and the other one in Liverpool that we opened in the middle of a global pandemic. So there's a bit of a story to that. Nicole, who's on the call, took the brunt of that that task. But the third thing that we do that I'm actually the most excited about, because I think is the thing that can have the biggest impact, not only here in Nova Scotia, not only in Atlantic Canada, but throughout rural North America. And that's our virtual business incubator, where we work with people in groups of 15 at a time. And over the course of 6 weeks, help them to figure out there's a great business to be built around their great idea. So we've been doing that here in Nova Scotia, primarily for the last 2 years. And just for some context, we put 180 people through that. We were funded to fill 180 spots. We put 200 people through that process to start over 120 companies in 60 different communities in every corner of rural Nova Scotia over the past 24 months. So now we're looking to branch that process out to see if we can replicate those results in other places. So that's what we do today.
That's great. So, and it's important to note that not only are you're helping a lot of people through the early steps of starting a business and ideation, validation, implementation, but you yourself are also a business. Where a lot of people, I think, there's a lot of support agencies that are not a business; they're like an agency or a government. I think that I'd like to know a little bit about, when did you start thinking of yourself as an entrepreneur and business owner? Like when, and maybe more specifically, when would you say you made the leap, that you decided that this is something I'm going to do as my own project and put my lifeline on the line?
Yeah, good question. So those are two different things. When I started to think about myself as an entrepreneur and when I actually started the business, those are two very different timelines, because so the inspiration for Mashup Lab came from about an 18-month period where I was just getting in, because of the work I had done in economic development. I was getting invited into lots of economic strategic planning sessions. And if you remember at the time, the Ivany report came out here in Nova Scotia, and then the Savoie report. And there was a bunch of people sort of talking about the things that needed to happen in Atlantic Canada, particularly in rural Atlantic Canada, to kind of turn the tide, right? We had this sort of stagnant growth. And for about an 18-month period, I was involved in all of these discussions. But at the end of every one of those discussions, it's like we kind of all looked around at each other and like, who's actually going to go do something about it? Like at some point, somebody's got to walk out that door and go to try and do something to fix this problem. And I just got frustrated with waiting for somebody else to sort of start with something. I'm like, I don't know if this is the right solution or not, but I know I can do this thing, this one thing that might make a difference in the story. And that's where it started. But it was a solid like 2.5, 3 years before I really got comfortable with the idea of calling myself an entrepreneur, because I don't know, like after working for that long with people that had, taken ideas and turned them into businesses and had established companies and were growing, like, I don't know, I just didn't feel like I belonged in that league. And I had a heavy dose of like imposter syndrome for a long, long time. And quite frankly, like I didn't make any money from Mashup Lab in those first 3 years. It was still a fluid idea that I was trying to figure out how to, use that as a way that feeds my kids and pays my mortgage. So I had a bunch of consulting gigs on the side that were paying the bills, but so I kind of felt like a bit of a fraud, right? And that's like, I have this Mashup Lab thing and it's my business, but it actually doesn't, generate any income for me yet. And I got to figure out other ways to pay my bills. So that was like I was really sort of conflicted by that for a long time. And eventually I just got over it and said, I'm an entrepreneur and I'm like, whether I like it or not. And eventually I figured out the business model around Mashup Lab. And there was a very intentional reason why I decided to start it as what I describe as a for more than profit company versus setting it up as a not-for-profit or, that way. So we can dive into any of that if you're interested. But yeah, I did that very purposefully.
I do want to touch on that. That's something something I'm very aligned with. I just as an interesting point, Sarah yesterday joined us and she was talking about how her stubbornness was an important quality that led her to be an entrepreneur. And I like how that is also similar to frustration. I think that frustration is a commonality I hear in a lot of people when they make that leap or decide to do something for themselves, is frustration with the status quo. I think that's great.
And there are like several like practical things as well. It's like, my wife's a physiotherapist at the local hospital. Like we put ourselves in a position where we didn't have a ton of debt. So like I had the privilege of being able to kind of explore this thing and not necessarily need to make a lot of money in order to pay our bills, right? So not everybody has that kind of opportunity as well. So it was a combination of that frustration, but it was very sort of the situation I found myself in, the privileged position I found myself in that allowed me to do it.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of people, like you have an idea, you're frustrated, you're stubborn, whatever it is, like you've decided to take a step. And actually translating that into the first actions, like how do you start to eat the elephant type thing? What was the first step for you? What were the first nuts and bolts that you said, okay, I'm going to take the first step, the first leap? What were they?
There were a couple of wrong ones. I can tell you that. So because I came from like government world, right? I was used to building up budgets and 1 and 3 year plans and all that stuff. So despite the fact that everything I was doing with Mashup Lab was based on this methodology of iteration and lean startup and all that stuff, like I wasn't drinking my own Kool-Aid when it came to actually getting my own business off the ground. So I had put together this very elaborate 3 year plan that required a $150,000 budget every year for the next 3 years, and spent 2 solid months pitching that to sponsors and anybody that would listen, anybody I thought might be able to write me a check. And at the end of 2 months, came home with like $0. And then faced with the fact that my current employment contract was going to end in 4 weeks. And I had just spent the last 2 months going out trying to raise money for this business idea, not finding a job. And I was going to stop getting a paycheck in 4 weeks. And I'm like, oh crap, I'm kind of screwed. So I got to figure out a different plan. So luckily, and this is one of the big, I think, lessons or takeaways, stories I share with, some of the entrepreneurs I work with is, at the time I was working in a co-working space in Mahone Bay and was surrounded by other entrepreneurial people doing entrepreneurial things, and got a ton of really great sobering advice around what to do and how to handle that situation. Otherwise, it would have been very easy for the whole thing to just kind of crash and burn. but took a step back and then started to run a few events. So instead of a $150,000 budget, I went and found $5,000 in sponsorship to cover the cost of running some events over the course of 6 months. And then that helped me get connected with some entrepreneurs that we, put through the sort of plan, the process that I was developing, and that turned into the next opportunity, then the next opportunity, which eventually led into me not taking in any more consulting work and actually figuring out how to allow Mashup Lab to feed my kids.
One of my favorite things is when you hear somebody talk about hindsight through these journeys, it's like, oh, that sounds like a super easy organic path. It's like, and we all know that it wasn't. It has its ups and downs. One of the, and I'm sure you get this all the time, is a lot of people, I'm going to come back to this, but I'd like to talk about the word startup. But before, a lot of people think about startups and think investment. And like you said, I'm looking for 150 grand for 3 years. Like I need to find the reason. I need somebody to cut the check. What are the realities for you on how you actually financially made this happen, especially in the early days? I mean, feel free to share as much or as little as you'd like. And any real takeaways on what that's like for some of the other entrepreneurs you see. Like because I'm talking to a lot of people, like they think that is the biggest barrier. And I think that both of us are in a line that that's not the biggest barrier.
No, I wouldn't think so. I think the story we've been told and the dominant narrative, for very good reason, right? And in Atlantic Canada in particular, we've had some major successes over the last 10 years of people using us a very specific playbook, right? Starting a highly scalable, technology-enabled, digitally based company, getting a bunch of venture capital, and then turning that into a major exit. And that's a very sort of highly valuable and valid playbook, but it's not necessarily the only playbook, right? And so I think, for me, it was, this, breaking away from this sort of narrative around you're either all in on this business idea and that's what you're doing full time and you're fully committed to that, and you're not working a part-time job or a full-time job, and like you're all in on this thing. And I just don't think that's the reality for most folks. I think, and I don't think it's the story that, the startup story of most businesses. I think, when you look under the hood, there's more stories that say, I worked my full-time job until the very last possible moment and got that paycheck every 2 weeks before taking that leap. And it was more of a transition to entrepreneurship instead of a leap to entrepreneurship. And if you sort of set it up that way, there's a ton of stuff that you can do with a little bit of focus and a little bit of intention around testing and figuring out the business model. So instead of like spending 10 hours a week watching Tiger King on Netflix, like you spend 10 hours a week trying to, figure out how to, create a business model around this idea that you have. And so once you take that like financial pressure off, and that was the thing that got me started, right? It's like, I'll never forget it. Alistair Jarvis with Woods Camp here in Nova Scotia. He was one of the co-working space members, and I came to him that day when I realized I've got only 3 or 4 weeks left before my paycheck stops, and I don't have a backup plan. He's like, Andrew, you got to go figure it. Like, just put Mashup Lab thing to the side for a second. You got 2 kids to feed. Like, you got to go figure out how to make some money, dude. Like that is task number 1 on your Mashup Lab plan. Is like, don't go hungry. Like, figure out a way to get a paycheck. And
put your mask on first.
yeah, put your mask on first. And but so when my plan went from having to raise 150,000 to like, now I just have to go and test and figure some things out. What's the minimum viable version of the thing I was hoping to create that is going to help me to learn the fastest, not necessarily make the most money, but maximize my learning. And so that was sort of a key sort of mental shift. And I think a lot of people get hung up on that this notion of it's just a side hustle or just a hobby business, with a little bit of focus and attention, it could easily turn into, your full-time gig.
So we had a bit of this discussion earlier. How do you feel about the word startup?
Hate it.
I like that to come out in conversation. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about why.
Yeah, no, because because I think it comes with all sorts of connotations of what's a viable business and what's not. And again, for very good reasons. I'm not suggesting that it's a false story. I just think it's a dominant narrative that a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of our untapped entrepreneurial talent don't see themselves in that story. Or in that word, or the things that come along with that word. It means something different. And I think it's been overused so much over the last 10 years that it's kind of lost its meaning. And I think I don't know what should replace it, but I know that a lot of the folks that I work with don't necessarily see themselves in that story. They don't call themselves startup founders. They don't even call themselves entrepreneurs. Right? It's I'm a person with an idea. I have an idea. They don't even have a business yet. So I think some of those labels actually disincentivize or are uninspiring to the vast majority of entrepreneurial talent that we see, especially in rural places that are sitting on the sidelines. So we've taken our approach to say, can we use a different language set? Can we use a different approach that might be it's not necessarily an accessibility issue, it's an approachability issue, right? So those are two very different things. And we can talk about the crappy rural internet, but from an accessibility standpoint, but it's really, I spent a lot of time thinking about how do I make this idea of starting a business more approachable to a wider group of people. And I think that's been become a bit of our secret sauce.
So one of the questions I like to ask, and I think you already touched on it, so tell me if that's everything, is I'm curious about why you are currently doing what you're doing. I think we've covered why you started it and what got you going and what created it. Has that changed? Like, why are you as energized now to grow and change and continue now? Like, what's the why now?
So for me, it's like the idea that there is untapped potential out there is like absolutely tragic. Like, I get upset thinking about it. I get emotional thinking about it because I think there's a lot of people that are stuck in a rut or stuck in a crappy minimum wage job with a little bit of a mindset shift, a little boost of courage, a little bit of somebody in their corner can make a huge difference, not only for themselves but their family, their lives, but their entire community. Like, you have somebody starting a business that hires 2 or 3 people in a small town, in rural, wherever, that makes a huge impact, right? It doesn't even move the needle in an urban center, but in a place like Shelburne, or a place like McAdam, or a place like Moose Jaw, it has a huge impact, right? And so I've seen that story, and I think that's what gets me fired up, is the idea that there are people out there that could be reaching a higher potential for themselves. Whether they choose to pursue it or not is completely a different matter. But to show them what's in the realm of the possible, and give them an option to choose this path versus just sticking at their regular full-time job, I think is what gets me fired up. And what we're learning is that those people exist just as much in rural Nova Scotia as they do in rural Wisconsin, and rural Saskatchewan, and rural Ontario, and rural BC, and rural California, and rural anywhere else. And maybe they exist in other places too, but I've spent the last 20 years in rural, so that's where I see it, right? But I'm sure it's the city of Rochester and some of their neighborhoods within that city probably are facing very similar challenges.
For sure. I gotta say, like, I'm really appreciative, and I know that the rest of the audience can feel your passion and the reasons and your why. Like, I can feel your why. It's hitting me. The reason for this speaker series is I wanted to indoctrinate and influence my team, and my why is helping people and working with clients who are like you. So to that end, I know I happen to know some of your team, and I know some of them are here. So it's super self-conscious for you to talk about them. But I would love to have anything that you think you guys are doing great in creating that passion, understanding in your team. How have you, over the years, built a strong team to help you implement what you're doing? Because I know that you have a strong team and you can't do this all on your own. Any big wins or things that you can pass on that others could learn?
Yeah, so a couple. And I think I'm still. We've been so outward focused on doing what it is we're doing, heads down, just figuring out the model, figuring out how to do the work we do more efficiently, and scaling across, the entire province. And now we're, expanding beyond Nova Scotia and potentially into the US. So we've been so heads down. Like, I'm not sure if I've done a good enough job sort of with that whole sort of why and story piece. Is actually something that we've recently identified and something that we're working on right now. But I think the thing I got right probably 3 years ago was like checking my ego and being like super, super self-aware around the things I'm really good at and the things I'm not. And it sort of, because when you first start, like, you have no other option, right? Like, you don't have money to hire people. Like, maybe you can beg other folks to help you out, but they're not going to do that forever. So you're kind of stuck doing everything yourself. But eventually you kind of get to this sort of tipping point where you're like, okay, maybe there's something more I can do here. And just getting really, really self-aware and understanding that I needed somebody that are just as naturally good at all the stuff that I'm not. And that was Nicole, right? For me. So she's was employee number one. And just like, yeah, going into that, process, having learned some things, like I've brought a few other folks on the year before Nicole and I met. And so I learned what I was kind of really, really looking for, and got really clear around that. And then just as much as I could, and it took a while. It took me a long time to get used to the fact that I had this amazing team member now that could actually do a whole lot of stuff that I needed to just get out of the way and let them do what they do really, really well. So that's
taking notes right now. She's taking notes that you're going to get out of the way right now.
She's heard this from me before, right? And the same thing with Juanita that joined us, right? It was the same thing. We were at a critical point, Nicole and I, that we were like, we need somebody else to look after these things. And I think we've done a really great job of creating that sort of team environment. I bring them into to help me solve problems all the time.
So I think that this conversation has been really great. It's exactly what I was hoping for. I do probably assume that people are starting to think that this is all still rosy. We've talked a lot about positives, and I know that you're an open guy and you understand how important it is to share the hard, as long as we're also sharing the optimism. So I'm going to open up the floor. I'd love to share, I want to use the word stupidest, but what is the biggest mistake that you think you've made in the past that you wish you hadn't made, or that you wish somebody had told you or prepared you to not make?
Oh, how long do we have? And you just want me to pick one?
Well, you can pick a couple. We don't need to show everything, but I just want to make sure, because I don't know a single entrepreneur or business owner that hasn't made mistakes that from hindsight look absolutely like dumb things to do. And I think it's important that we share those. That's one of the reasons why I want the story experience to grow. So I know you're open with this and you don't mind sharing the road rash.
Not at all. I think it's super, super important. So a couple big mistakes I made in the very, very early days. And I think this is something that I was ill prepared for, transitioning from being an employee and a leader within an organization that gets a paycheck every 2 weeks, to transitioning into trying to get a new idea off the ground, something that was like very ambiguous, uncertain, that I was super passionate about, but still hadn't figured out. And there's actually a model for this that I wish I would have seen early on, because it would have prepared me for the roller coaster ride that I was about to go on, that I just was not prepared for. And
Uh-oh.
we're back.
Okay, so now we've really seen rural internet. That'll come up in the Q&A later. But I think you just started talking
About the big stupid mistakes I made.
Yeah,
that one. Yeah. So I was talking about this sort of framework for that process that I went through in the first, I would say, 6 months of trying to get this Mashup Lab idea thing off the ground. It's called the transition curve, by the guy by the name of Cameron Herold. So if you Google those two things, and you'll come up with an article and a sort of a process that he went through, and it starts off with this uninformed optimism. Right, so it's this when you're at the very early stages of that idea, the excitedness, and you're like, you struck onto something that you're super passionate about, but it's not really the viability of it as a business hasn't been validated by anything. It's just like pixie dust at this point, but you're super excited about it. So, and then he maps out the other sort of 5 phases of that. So having an understanding of that model and expecting that this is like a natural thing that entrepreneurs go through, and being more prepared for that. I probably wouldn't have let the highs get so high, and probably not let the lows get so low. So it took me, a good year to kind of orient myself to this new world of entrepreneurship and all of those feelings of like self-doubt and imposter syndrome and just being paralyzed by analysis paralysis to the point you can't even answer an email. But the big stupid mistake, was at that uninformed optimism phase, where you feel like you can take on the world, right? Your self-perceived confidence is like through the roof, right? You can manage anything. And because I was trying to raise $150,000 at the time, I'm like, great. So I had lined up a meeting with one of the most prominent angel investors in the region, who shall remain nameless, but you probably figure out who it is. And through my connections, and the network I had built, had lined up a meeting with this person. They were actually in the U.S. at the time, and through a couple of emails back and forth, he agreed to meet with me. But we didn't set sort of a time and day, so I thought I was going to end up having to jump on a plane and fly to the U.S. to go meet this person. I was more than willing, prepared to do it. Long story short, because I wanted to show him how passionate I was and committed was about this, and I had mapped out this spider web of I think it was 23 different businesses that I was going to connect to this idea of Mashup Lab, and all of the potential to grow something really super, super huge. 23 businesses I was going to launch in about an 18 to 24 month period. And all I needed from him was, about $1.5 million to make all that happen. And that's it. It was no big, and it was dropping a bucket for this guy. And I had a big plan and a big vision and super passionate. And so I said, okay, I need to show them I got some skin in the game. So in an 8-hour period, I felt like the most important thing for me to do was to go and spend. I only had $6,000 to launch this company in my bank account that I had to play with. My decision was to spend $4,000 on the .ca, .com, .org domain names for all of these 20-some businesses that didn't exist yet, and went through that $4,000 in like an hour or so, from midnight to 2 a.m. And so it was like, this is my moment to really jump into this startup entrepreneurship game. All that to say, we didn't end up getting the 1.5 million, and I actually have since sent him a note saying thank you for not giving me any money, because it was the wrong plan, and I learned so much more through the process. But here I am, that kind of stuff shakes your confidence, right? Because here I am, I'm a smart business guy. I know what I'm doing. I've been working with entrepreneurs for 20 years up to that point, making really smart business decisions, reaching leadership of organizations. And here I just dropped $4,000 on domain names, right? How stupid is this? And but it was because I was in that uninformed optimism phase. So obviously the story ends on a positive note, but if there was any advice, if you recognize that you're in that uninformed optimism phase, don't spend money, do not make investments. Wait until you're at a different phase of that transition curve to make those kinds of decisions, because you can make some foolish investments.
And you had an interesting line there. You said, and obviously it's ending on a positive note, but if you had stopped after the fact, that's I think that almost everybody I know who ended on a non-positive note is because after that they stopped and they didn't like the swing. Yeah, there's a lot to that.
Yeah, so Cameron calls that the bottom of that dip, the crisis of purpose phase. Yeah. So where you actually start questioning everything about what it is you're doing. And if you don't have systems, processes, routines, if you haven't surrounded yourself with good mentors and advisors at that point, the phase 4 is the crash and burn phase, right? Where you've either gone bankrupt or you've given up on the idea, and now you're in this sort of really deep funk, and all kinds of bad stuff happens. But if you can get yourself through that crisis of purpose up to the other side of it, which is informed optimism, you got a chance. So the goal is to kind of flatten that roller coaster ride out a little bit.
I gotta say, uninformed optimism is now in my vocabulary. I'm gonna start using that. That explains the concept so well. I have a couple interesting questions from the audience. A lot of people want to talk a little bit more about rural, and I know you like to talk about rural. So let's
I'm unapologetically rural.
Yeah,
I said that, right?
So the first one is, what do you think are the specific challenges that rural entrepreneurs face? And the obvious one is internet, they say, but like, what do you think?
I'm not going to talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what are the other specific challenges?
That is just a practical logistical challenge that needs to get solved, and will get solved eventually. Not soon enough, in my opinion, but it will get solved. So I'm not gonna waste people's time ranting about crappy rural internet, and because we figured out ways around it, right? So we've worked with now 200 entrepreneurs that are in places like Meat Cove that have almost zero cell service and crappy internet, and we still work with 6 or 7 entrepreneurs from that part of the province. But I think the bigger challenge is, there's been a evolution of a lot of these communities, where like they were born around sort of an entrepreneurial spirit, right? You had boat builders and blacksmiths, and people would be like kind of doing their own things. And then there was like a 100-year period where big industry came into these towns, not just here in Atlantic Canada, but in every rural place across North America, whether it was a gold mine or an oil patch or wheat fields, or whatever the big industry, forestry, fisheries, doesn't matter. But big industry came in, and then all of a sudden people were like, let's go work for the plant, right? And we spent 100 years in that space. So I think coming through that, now that some of those industries are in decline, and the reason a lot of those rural communities were built is now coming into questions, like, what do we do now if the paper mill isn't here to employ everybody? I think so. It's a bit of an identity crisis, but as a result of 100 years of that mindset of just like going to work for somebody else, I think a lot of entrepreneurs in rural places find themselves in a bit of a vacuum where they don't necessarily have a ton of encouragement from their friends or family, or like they don't necessarily have a network of people that really get it, right? That really understand. You would know what I mean by that. Like, until you've gone through that fire yourself, you really don't truly understand why you would put yourself through that, right? And I'll never forget this. I think this captures it brilliantly. I was running an event in Yarmouth one weekend, and I was on my way down there, and I stopped into Tim Hortons. And if you ever want to be completely demoralized and uninspired, no offense to the owners of Tim Hortons, but don't go to Tim Hortons. It can be a toxic environment, and I found zero inspiration in Tim Hortons. But I went to Tim Hortons, and there was the 2 young guys, probably in their mid-20s, at a table, sort of catching up, chatting. And one of the guys just got back from, I think, Fort McMurray or somewhere out west. And he was like sharing to his friend, like, oh, they're back in Alberta, there was this like the food truck that was doing this like really unique cuisine, and I was thinking about something that could really work here. Like, I come back here, there's really no place that has this kind of stuff, and I'm really looking at that model. And his buddy that hadn't left Shelburne said, "Why would you do that, man? That's the dumbest idea I've heard." Right? So surrounding themselves with people that don't necessarily get it, I think is a huge impediment, and that combined with sort of the dominant narrative when we think about entrepreneurship and the whole sort of startup scene and all those things, a lot of the stories get told about companies that are formed in Halifax, St. John, Fredericton, Moncton, Sydney, St. John's, Newfoundland, all that stuff. But if you look under the hood, a lot of those founders are from places like Pubnico and Canning, and right, this just so happened they found themselves in the city. But the dominant narrative comes from those centers, and deservedly so. Like, I'm not sort of knocking it. I'm just saying that's the reality, and I think the challenge some rural entrepreneurs have is really sort of plugging into a network of people that get it, understand it, and believe in their ideas, and believe that, just because you don't necessarily want to go down the venture capital route and scale to a huge company doesn't mean you can't have a very vibrant, profitable, successful business.
So we had another question just come in that's really something that I'd love to share, especially if you have something that you've learned from it. Sometimes this is just you've just made it through and you don't really know how you made it through. That's totally okay to share. But we have a question about how you mentioned about coming through the stages, and you had the moments of lack of confidence and imposter syndrome, and I don't know anybody in your world who doesn't have those. How did you stay inspired, and how have you stayed excited in the long term? And especially, is there any structure or learnings that anybody could adopt, or are you still not sure how you're figuring it out?
Definitely some things that have worked well for me. So first things first, getting a system and routine that helps you manage your energy, right? So I was just kind of like winging it, but I have I have a process now. I have a system and things that I do every day, every week that help me to just kind of manage not only just the workload and the productivity tools, but just to manage my own sort of mental state and energy. And it's a work in progress, and there's lots of things that work well for me that might not work well for other folks, but find whatever that is, that thing that's going to be that constant stability in your day, in your week, in your month. And I think that one of the things that really sort of got me through was, even though there were questions around the business model, I call it my hot shit folder. So I have a hot shit folder, and it is a collection of thank you cards and emails I got from entrepreneurs and people that said, you know what, you made a difference in work. Yeah, exactly. All of those kinds of things. And often they'll come in by email, right? People don't necessarily send the cards anymore, but I print those, I save them, I print those things off, and I don't have to refer to that hot shit folder as much as I did in those early days. But there were some days that when you're in that crisis of meaning mode, to say, you know what, because sometimes you feel completely useless, right? Like you can't even function to the point, like I said, to respond to a simple email seems like to be the biggest task of the day. So you can really start to question yourself, and if you don't have a way to get out of that tailspin, then you can find yourself in a pretty dark spot. And booze comes into play, and drugs come into play, and all that stuff.
So I just want to come in on that point, because you and I have had a lot of conversations about balance and the idea, like we were both members of the Wallace McCain Institute. We both talk about one life, and it's not just a work versus home. You have made lots of different lifestyle design choices around balance, and I'd love anything you'd like to share around what balance means to you in business.
I don't think about it as balance as an entrepreneur. I think about it as like integration of things. And it was something that my family had to get used to as well, right? Like I was on a call last night with a group of folks in Saskatchewan from 9 p.m. to 10:30, right? And sometimes I'm not going to be around. I don't have a 9-to-5 job. Sometimes I'm going to be away for 3 days, and sometimes I'm going to be able to take 3 days off and go and take them to sort of the virtual reality game room in Halifax, right? Like, so it was just kind of getting used to the fact that this isn't about balance. This is a one life. This is me as an entrepreneur behind this business, and integrating those two things in a way that allows you not to neglect the things that are important to you, which includes your family and your kids, but also include your bank account, and includes the mission you're on in life, and all of that stuff. So just figuring out a way to kind of integrate those two things. And sometimes that equation is by necessity is going to be out of balance, right? There's going to be going from September through to November for us. Like, I don't see my kids nearly enough, right? But they know that if we can get through that 3-month period, the period from like Christmas through to like the middle of January, I'm around. I'm not going anywhere. And that's when we really get quality time. So, for when they were younger, it was kind of harder for them to kind of wrap their heads around that. But now it's like they get it, right? They understand that, I'm going to be checked out for a period of time, but I'm going to be checked back in with them as well, and do everything I can to sort of stay connected with them in those busy times. So, and I think for me, I put less of a priority on my own health, right? So just back in May, I found myself in a place where I put on the COVID-19, as they call it. I had hit my, I was just feeling like crap, and sort of because of my Wallace McCain experience and having that forum to be able to go and put your stuff on the table and get some advice on how to help it. I'd started down this path of like trying to do something every day, 30 minutes of whatever it was, and just got started. And as much as I hated it, just kept up with it. And I'm on day 278 now 268 of every day doing 30 minutes of activity. It's had a huge impact, right, in my mental health and my physical well-being and all that stuff. It's not something I would have done before, but doing hard things matters, right?
Absolutely. I have one main area that I do want to touch on, because we're really aligned in this, and it's along your comments of for more than profit. Like, I think you and I have had these discussions, but I'm a big believer that the future, those lines become blurrier every day. Like most entrepreneurs I know are creating their business or doing what they're doing to create a positive impact or change in some aspect. So I'm a big believer, social enterprise, more than profit, triple bottom line, B Corp. I'm all there. I'd love to have your thoughts on what that means and what you see yourself as and the future of business. Just any thoughts you'd like to share?
So for me, it was more about sort of breaking away from the traditional model of how this kind of work gets funded, because in the year prior to a year and a half prior to starting Mashup Lab, in November of that year, at the time I was executive director of the Lunenburg Queens Regional Development Agency, so a regional economic development agency, and had been in that role for about two years, and we're doing some cool stuff and making some progress, and had the Minister of Business at the time and at a podium at a press conference saying, holding us up as like, this is the kind of stuff we need to be doing more of. That was in November. And then in December, getting a letter saying you're no longer being funded at the end of March, and you got to write your own letter of dismissal, right? And say at the end of March your money's gone and we're going on to a different model, and which I didn't necessarily disagree with, but it just proved to me that how the the shifts in government policies and how most of the stuff gets funded just wasn't sustainable. Like, for me, the work was too important to rely on the whims of sort of government strategy and priority. And what that did was allowed me to, like, if I had just gone down the path of chasing the government dollars to fund another sort of not-for-profit thing, then I would have had to fit into that policy, and I probably wouldn't have struck on this whole sort of untapped pool of entrepreneurial talent. I just would have been chasing the same kind of archetype, right? That is in this like tech-enabled, high growth, potential business. And we've since found that there's lots of those people that are that thing that just don't plug into that archetype. So for me, it was just like wanting to figure out how this thing gets created and this work gets done without relying on sort of just regular government funding every year. But like more than that, I think in terms of like the entrepreneurs I work with, I think people, especially in rural, and I'm sure a lot of this exists in urban centers as well, but I think people are really interested in connectedness, right? And even though we're highly connected, I don't think there's a lot of connectedness. And in a rural place, like, you really rely on your neighbors sometimes to help you shovel the driveway, or you can't just go to the to the local hardware store and get everything you need all the time. And more than that, I think like a self-reliance around people getting a little sort of disengaged with like global systems of things and relying on big corporations to do stuff. I think there's just a natural shifting away from wanting to be more sort of locally sourced, whether it's our power generation or our food sources or whatever it might be. And I think those kinds, that mindset feeds itself really well into this notion of for more than profit entity, where you are a little bit self-reliant, but you're not just doing things to maximize the amount of profit you can keep in your bank account. It's really about doing something and making decisions that take into consideration lots of different factors, not just the financial ones. That being said, like, I'm unapologetic with rural, but I'm also unapologetically like profit driven, because I know that if I got $1 million sitting in my bank account, it's not because I want to like buy a new car every 6 months or take my kids to Disneyland, 3 times a year, whenever that happens. It's because I know there are things that need to happen in my community I want to see happen, and I don't want to have to wait for somebody else to give me money to do it. I want to be able to write that check and say, let's make it happen. Yeah. Right. So that's what drives
me. I used to do a lot of public speaking around this, and I used to have a whole segment around profit's not a dirty word. But maximizing profit might be. So it was like, because imagine if more people with our mindset had more money, the things that would be happening. So I do believe it. No mission without margin, all those things. So we're coming to the end of our time, and maybe this is part one. I really enjoyed it. One of the things I selfishly ask every time I do one of these discussions, online or offline, is you're an influencer, you're an educator, you're really on the path of self-design and learning. If you have to recommend 1 or 2 information sources, I'm thinking books or podcasts or whatever, what are the things you really recommend for like perspective shifting or really solid resources?
Yeah, so I'm a bit all over the map. My curiosity, just because of the fact that I work with a couple thousand entrepreneurs and they're in different industries, I'm a bit scattered in where I get sort of my information from. But things that have had a directional impact on how I sort of approach business, that mindset, is a book called Good to Great. It's a classic. It's probably well read and very familiar to a lot of folks. There's another resource or a book called Never Eat Alone. It's really about how it's a really sort of interesting take on how to engage a community of people with the opportunities you have to do that. One that we're using as a team that's proven to be super effective, we don't necessarily prescribe to it directly, is this one here, Scrum, the art of doing twice the work in half the time. There's a lot of good elements in that has helped us to do exactly that, put us in a position to scale. And everybody that joins my team does this one, StressFinder. So this was a game changer for me.
So my team have all done it. So they will recognize that for sure. It's something that we do in our hiring process prior to the decision being made, for sure. So I don't want to take too much more of your time. I know a few people would love to have a chat with you after we finish. Is there anything that you would like to share, both with people who watch this video or people who are here now, that I haven't covered in the interview? Any last words?
Yeah, so we're at a really exciting kind of evolution point in sort of the Mashup Lab story, where, like I said, we've I think struck on and learned some things from piloting some of our approaches here in rural Nova Scotia that I believe can be helpful in other rural places. So, like, we've just launched some of our programming in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. We've got conversations happening in the other 3 Atlantic provinces. We're looking to do more activity here. So to fill those 200 spots that we filled, we actually got 450 applications to fill those 200 spots from every corner of the province. So we can be doing more here. And we are close to getting an agreement in place to launch into Wisconsin, likely before the end of the year as well. So don't want to jinx that. It's still lots of stuff that can throw that off the rails. But I guess my point is, I think the things we're learning here can be helpful in lots of other places. So what would be super helpful for us and for me is, like, if there are people on the call that have friends, family, and other rural places across the country and throughout rural North America that might be interested in seeing more people with ideas turn those ideas into viable businesses, and we'd love to chat with them. And maybe there's something we can do to be helpful so that they don't have to spend 7 years that took us to kind of learn the things that we do. But
don't want everybody to learn it the hard way. Well, it's going to be hard, but well, thank you very much, Andrew, for joining us. This is great. This is a new series. I'm excited to see where it goes, and I think both of us are aligned in the telling of these real stories, and that it's not all rosy, but there's lots of really great optimism, informed optimism. Then I like where it's going to go. Thank you very much. And we're
awesome.
going to come
Thanks
down.
for the invite, Levi.
All right.